Friend, enemy, or frenemy? How do Indians view the rise of China and its implications for India's rise? Join the conversation on this important topic by taking the China Challenge survey. The survey has been put together by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. Answer our 10 simple questions and let your voice be heard in shaping India's policy towards China. For more details, log on to www.takshashila.org.in or you can click on the link and take the survey in the show notes. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka, a research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program and your host for this episode. And today, I'm joined by my colleagues from the institution, Satya, who's a research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics program, and Amit Kumar, who's an analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program. Welcome to the episode.
Hi, Anushka.
Thanks, Anushka.
Right. So today we thought we can have a chat about semiconductors and the advances China has made in capturing the market share of legacy or trailing edge chips. And the question I'm going to be asking Satya and Amit today is about how serious China's advances can be considered and whether these can amount to a dominance in the future that can threaten viability of diversifying markets of legacy or trailing edge chips, and whether this has causes for concern in the US. Another question that I'm going to be asking them will concern what steps countries like the US and its allies can take to counter such a dominance to create a diversified market for legacy or trailing edge chips and therefore an economically sustainable future. And finally, we're going to discuss India's potential role in this diversification. And we're also going to talk about India-US technology relations in this regard and whether that can provide an effective counter to China's advances. In that context, Satya and Amit, my first question to both of you is, what exactly is it that we understand when we use the phrase legacy or trailing edge semiconductors or chips? And what is really their importance? Why are they so critical when all the discussion in technology geopolitics today surrounds advanced chips, especially those that are of 7 nanometer or less? So why do these legacy chips and kind of having control over their supply chains really matter to countries today? Over to you, Satya.
Hi, Anushka. So generally speaking, if we borrow the CHIPS Act parlance, then any semiconductors that have been fabricated on a process node that is older than 28 nanometers, say, are classified as legacy chips. Now, legacy or commodity chips or what we call trailing edge chips are manufactured on processes that were once advanced or leading edge, but have now become mature enough over a couple of decades or so. And they are used to fabricate chips that go into almost everything around us, right? So these are not the chips that run your PC or laptops, the latest games, or your PS5 or Xbox's systems. These are the chips that go into CCTV cameras, that go into power grids, critical infrastructure, even defense equipment. And the main reason why this has ended up being a geopolitical flashpoint is because over the last 2-3 decades, we have seen a gradual shift of the fabrication segment for these chips also shift to East Asia and China. So what has ended up happening is that China has become very good at fabricating these chips, and the concomitant ecosystem that is needed to fabricate this at scale. Because China has a very large market, domestic market, so it's easier for their foundries to reach economies of scale, needed to produce this at volume and also export it. The equipment needed for fabricating these chips are also considerably less expensive, and China has also begun and maintained um domestic capability to produce this equipment and the materials needed to make them, right. So opposed to advanced chips, which are your 7 nanometers and below, which require even more advanced chip making equipment like the photolithography machines from ASML, DUV and UV machines, respectively. Those cost upwards of, like, I don't know, $100 million single machine. And those things are not something that China has the ability to make right now. So whatever it is using right now, it's already imported from ASML and other vendors throughout the world over the last few years. And ever since the export sanctions have hit China from the US, those things have become harder to maintain. And it's not something that China can build capability in a couple of years, right? So yeah, so that's why legacy chips have become a huge geopolitical flashpoint.
Right. Thanks for that lay of the land, Satya. Amit, if I can come to you with the same question, but perhaps articulated in a more specific manner. So, Satya talked about how legacy chips are extremely important, not only because they go into really important equipment and critical information infrastructure, but also because in the geopolitical environment of today, the fact that their production is extremely concentrated in both Taiwan and China, with China seemingly occupying 30% of the market share in their production, it kind of could create disruptions in the supply chain. And of course, from a securitized lens that perhaps the US led geopolitical West adopts, it doesn't necessarily seem to be in their interest. So, Amit, if I can come to you, what has enabled China to secure this dominance or this economically sustainable kind of industrial base when it comes to the production of legacy chips? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Anushka. So there are multiple reasons why China has went on to secure such a dominating position. If I just may, it's as you rightly pointed out, it harbors around 30% of the global mature node fabrication capacity at this point of time, and it's only behind Taiwan's 49%. Around 50% is currently captured by Taiwan. But projections estimate that Beijing's share will increase to about 39% in the next 3 years, and that's massive. 10 percentage point increase in just 3 years. That's massive. And of course, China is also investing a lot of money into this, so we might see some changes on that front as well in the percentage terms, right? And again, if few months back, the Chinese themselves reported that its output of legacy chips soared by a massive 40% the last quarter of 2024, and this was thrice the units that they produced in quarter one of 2019, 4 years back, right? And that itself tells us that China has been making substantive progress on this front, right? Coming back to your question, why Beijing has been able to achieve all of this, I would say there are largely three to four broad reasons for it to emerge as a dominant player, and soon it might go on to become a predominant player in this legacy chips domain, right? To begin with, the existing US export controls that we have seen so far, be it October 7 in 2022 and October 17, 2023, export regulations or restrictions that the US has imposed so far on China. It has it Both these denial regimes only target the advanced semiconductor technologies, and legacy chips were left out of this category because they were not largely regarded as a national security threat, or presence of the adversary was not thought to be a national security threat at that point of time. Secondly, legacy or commodity chips are extremely cheap to produce as compared to the advanced semiconductors. And this makes it easier for China to match capital investments against its competitors like US or maybe Taiwan or South Korea, etc. Right? And because we also know that these are relatively cheap to produce, the profit margins also in this segment is also very less, right? And China, through its subsidy and other support that it provides to its industry, makes it easier for these companies to sustain and make profit and survive in this very competitive, cutthroat competition market. Uh, thirdly, China also has homegrown capabilities now in mature node fabrication, as We just saw that it captures around 30% of the market at this point of time, and is not necessarily dependent on foreign support. Like it is when it comes to advanced semiconductors and its dependence on ASML and other design or IP rights, right? So in this category or in this domain, China is not necessarily dependent on foreign capabilities, and rather has its domestic capabilities that it rely on to boost its presence in this domain, right? Three reasons. Lastly, I would say China has also been investing a lot of money in this thing, and lately we see that there has been a diversion from its earlier uh, vast expenditure in advanced semiconductor nodes or to processing nodes to legacy nodes, because China realizes that it becomes difficult for it to catch up in the advanced segment. Some of the money is being redirected towards even in the legacy nodes. So these are the three to four broad reasons why China has been able to make a substantive gain, and this is something which has sparked concerns across the West, especially the US.
Um, Thanks for that, Amit. That's interesting stuff. Satya, if I can come to you and pick up on a thread that Amit talked about, which is China, the Chinese party state massively subsidizing such a production and moving a lot of its money from advanced semiconductor production to legacy nodes. Just wanted to know your thoughts on why such a move will be feasible in China's context, but not so much in the US's context. Let's assume the US makes the case that we're going to fight fire with fire and redirect some of the funding that, say, under the Chips and Science Act, we've been targeting towards R&D or domestic fabrication capabilities and advanced chips towards fabrication of legacy nodes, and of course not just do that, which is incentivize domestic production by subsidizing or diverting money, but also sanction Chinese kind of access to machines that are used in production of trailing edge chips. So why wouldn't this combination of domestic incentivization and external sanction work for the US as well as it can for China?
That's the primary question that a lot of people are asking in the US as well, right? So to be clear, the US is doing it, and not on the export controls restricting equipments, etc., to for China's trailing edge fabrication facilities, but more so on the fact that they are focusing on building up domestic capacity in trailing edge nodes, right? Now, again, so also what we call trailing edge is kind of also fluid here. A lot of the fabs that Intel or TSMC are seeking to establish in the US are range from somewhere between 16 nanometers to I think 2 nanometers as well. So 16 nanometers is also, well, quote unquote old right now, but it is fairly advanced still compared to a lot of the trailing edge chips are made on, which is usually 90 nanometers, 65 nanometers and above, sometimes even 180 and 300 nanometers as well. So on some level, the building this domestic capacity will give the US some resilience once they start, spin up. However, the problem is, um, first of all, the export controls on or second level sanctions on chip making equipment needed for trailing edge chip fabrication will not be very effective because China already has domestic capability of making this equipment, right? The other problem is it's not just a factor of stopping China from making this, it's also the fact that a lot of these chips end up in finished products, in consumer electronics, or even intermediate components that's needed for like final goods that are used in downstream industries, right? So, like for instance, a mic may have a subassembly of with a chip that's made in China, and that ends up being assembled in the Malaysia under a US brand, etc. Right? Without the provenance or the audit trail to figure all of this out, and it's very difficult to do this across the board because you have so many industries everywhere making all of this stuff, right? Um, they will inevitably end up getting to the US anyway. And because a lot of US and other Western industries are so reliant on these intermediate or finished goods, as well as the Chinese trailing edge chips as well, it's difficult for them to take on such a drastic step as restricting access of Chinese chips to markets elsewhere, because it would affect them negatively as well. Right? So there's a lot of unintended consequences. The other problem is even if the US does end up creating some domestic capacity, in the short term they can First of all, it's relatively cheaper to set up a trailing edge fabrication facility compared to more advanced ones, as a rule of thumb. However, the reason why trailing edge facilities are, like command a lion's share of the market is because they were established at a time when those nodes were the most advanced ones, and the profits that have been made since then have helped establish, newer node production facilities, right? More advanced production facilities, and therefore being having to establish old process node capable production facilities again from scratch may actually be more capital cost intensive compared to, using a pre-existing facility, something like that, right? So that is somewhat of a unintuitive kind of answer to this. But even if, for instance, the US does this, right, it establishes a bunch of legacy chip production facilities, it is still going to offset some of this capital cost by subsidies, state or federal, doesn't matter. But over the long term, the fact that US labor costs, US production costs will just generally be higher, as it is, which is why most chip fabrication ended up being in East Asia anyway over time. That will make the end products, right, the chips that roll out of the production line at the end of 3 to 4 years, will just not be as competitive on price compared to other East Asian legacy chips, etc. Right? So cost competitiveness is a huge factor, because remember, these are going to be components that will be used in end products, and those end products will also need to be cost competitive as well. So yeah, that's just one of many unintended consequences. So essentially, the idea is that the US, if it tries to do this, will not be building to its competitive advantage.
Right. So clearly, Satya, you've explained that both subsidies and sanctions are something that the US is attempting to pursue, but reversing the gear would not only require more intensive investment, even though the cost for establishing a production facility for legacy nodes may not be as much as advanced chips. And of course, it will have downstream implications for the American industrial base. And given that the US government is involved in a kind of in studying a bunch of supply chain hassles and vulnerabilities anyway, the backtracking where semi assemblies came from would again be an arduous task. But in this regard, Amit, I know for a fact that Chinese subsidies have worked really well, and this is something we've alluded to in our introduction as well. And before we come to a discussion on what then can US's options be and where does India figure in this, can you talk a little bit about what the Chinese government's contemporary focus is on subsidizing legacy chip production? Are they planning to continue with production facilities that they've had for the longest time, given that most of them haven't had the turnaround to advance semiconductor manufacturing? And are there any big funding programs analogous to the Chips and Science Act in the US that is in the works?
See, I wouldn't say the Chinese subsidies have worked really well. One, because there have been a lot of wasteful expenses where when China started back in like 10-15 years back, right, and started pumping a lot of money into this semiconductor sector. And to reach this position, China has wasted or has pumped in a lot of money without, I would say, expected benefits, right? Even to get to this level, it has pumped in a lot of money without a huge success, right? So the subsidies haven't worked so well, but it has managed to gain some market share in the process, right? And I can't really pinpoint fingers and tell you whether there have been a strategic relocation of the funds from advanced to legacy. But from the trends that we are seeing today, it seems like they're investing more and more money in the legacy nodes or the legacy chips segment than they are doing in the advanced. And there could be broad reasons for why, because now, since after this export control measures, it has become difficult for them to source some of these materials, and it only makes sense for them to invest a large segment of the mature nodes, which is easier to do it as compared to the advanced nodes. So it seems likely that there's some shift in focus, and the results are encouraging in that regard. In the sense that the Chinese are capturing more and more market share, and at a very high speed. Right now, coming to the question that you asked, if not this, then what? Satya brilliantly explained why some of these measures that would not work with the US. But just to add, the other factor would be that US is already involved in this game of competing with Chinese in the advanced semiconductors, and therefore it has been investing and cornering a large amount of money towards even rolling out industrial policy in that regard. So it only makes sense for it to not compete in this regard. Now, having said that, what are the options that the US has? So one of the greatest advantages that the US has is its system of alliances and partnerships, right? And something that the Chinese do not have. And in that regard, the US must seek to leverage these partnerships and alliances to distribute the cost and optimize the respective comparative advantages that each of the countries in its alliances and partnerships have. Now, in this slide, I think, in my opinion, friendshoring becomes a very feasible option against all the other things that we discussed. And I say that because, again, for the reasons that I've already stated, but when it comes to friendshoring, a few contests come up. Likely contenders are Vietnam, Malaysia, and India. These are three key likely. And each of these governments have also announced some packages to prop up this and expand this industry, right? But the problem with and I can we can come to this later in the section podcast. But I think India friendshoring is the way for the Americans to go forward, and I think India will play a large role and a very important role in this regard.
Right. Interesting stuff, Amit. And you've obviously presented an optimistic picture of India's role in US's kind of friendshoring strategy. And you've also said that friendshoring would be, in your opinion, the way to go forward. Satya, do you agree with the former assessment on India's role despite the existence of many contenders? I'm assuming many of these contenders would be countries like Vietnam and, of course, Mexico, maybe other countries that have become important otherwise in the global kind of quest for diversification and de risking. And so, who, in your opinion, are these contenders, and why should we say that India has the best kind of game plan of them all to kind of host any funding or any collaboration when it comes to semiconductor manufacture in the, of course, legacy chips?
Right. Yeah. So as Amit pointed out, the usual contenders for this are Vietnam, Malaysia, a lot of Southeast Asian and East Asian countries. And the reason for this is partly historic in the sense that a lot of these countries already have existing bases of assembly plants, etc., or like small scale, low volume production, maybe fabrication. Now, and that gives them a somewhat of an advantage in the fact that they have maybe a readily available downstream ecosystem, the assembly and test facilities that already exist for them to link up to fabrication if fabrication is established there. So that is one advantage in favor of them. The other thing is that because these countries were generally considered the satellite countries around China, as China became the factory of the world, these countries also had like enough experience dealing with supply chains, etc. So that is another thing in favor of them. However, first, I mean, Amit would know better than me about this, is the fact that if the US wants to reshore, or US and its allies want to reshore or friendshore to Southeast Asia, then it does not make for a very resilient supply chain, right? So the first thing is the South China Sea is constantly susceptible to Chinese PLA aggressions. Sea lines of communications may be compromised. Then the other part is that the flip side of it, which is the West Philippine Sea. What is so that's also not necessarily the best trade routes, right? So it's, the weather is not great. So in that way, India is relatively much more calm, right? So geographically, it's better suited to be a friend-shoring nation. The other thing is geopolitical alignment, right? So India's current situation and its interests also make it a suitable partner for geopolitically aligning with the US and on emerging and critical areas of technology, of finance, of energy transition, all of that stuff, right? So, and we have seen that come into practice with India and US under the ICET, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, with the Quad, and then we have other things, right? So, like for instance, India joining the Artemis program, which is at the cutting edge of human spaceflight and everything. So, all of those things makes India a safer bet compared to Southeast Asian countries, even though India may be starting on this journey later. The other thing is India has the capacity, or the surplus income, etc., to be able to absorb a lot of the upfront capital costs that are going to be arising because of starting an entirely new fabrication ecosystem from scratch. So it may not be competitive right now, but as it's starting out, India has the land and it has the union and state governments financial and long-term support to basically ensure that any friend shoring company or any diversifying company from the West can come set up here without having to worry about bearing that cost and then waiting for years to become price competitive, right? So they can start spinning their facilities up, and so it'll be easier.
Right. Of course, interesting stuff, Satya. And I think towards the end, you've talked about the domestic. Of course, the geopolitical alignment and values and interest based alignment is one bit. But towards the end, you started talking about the domestic capabilities that India perhaps boasts, that despite it starting later off on this journey than its South Asian counterparts, make it a viable option for the US's or the US led West's quest for diversification and friendshoring. Amit, can you throw a little bit light on some of the other domestic factors, maybe skill sets when it comes to labor costs, the existence of enhanced bureaucratic procedures to enable production of semiconductors? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, but just to add on to the point that Satya made initially about the supply chain resilience, like that's very important, right? The major concern why it has China's dominance has sparked concerns in the US is because now they're really insecure of the national security when it comes to national security and how China might have a say at last in some of the questions around national security. And if indeed you are looking to make your supply chains robust, it necessarily is not a great idea to just relocate and reshore from China to in the neighboring regions of the Chinese, where China is still very dominant and powerful and aggressive. And we know for a fact that Taiwanese Strait, the South China Sea, East China Sea, they are kind of volatile, not just because of the Chinese, but also now because of North Korea and other and the involvement of Russians in that part of the Indo-Pacific. So, if indeed security of the supply chains is the goal, India makes a better case. The fact that it's geographically isolated in that sense from that region, and the Bay of Bengal and or the Arabian Sea, or if you look at the northern Indian Ocean, is largely a secure sea area. Right, it becomes like it's the safest bet that the US or the Americans have in that regard. Right now, also the fact that you talked about some of the domestic capabilities, of course. So I would like to point out that one of the complaints that the American businesses or foreign businesses looking to reshift, like even the narrative around China plus one, is that the businesses, even though India is open to foreign investment, the ease of doing business is not necessarily. India is still not up there when you compare it with other countries like the other China plus one contenders, or even this case like Vietnam or Malaysia. They are far better performers when it comes to attracting businesses because of the ease of doing business, right? So this has been a recurrent complaint of the foreign investors and businesses looking to relocate to India. But what you have a situation today in India where the government has taken very keen interest in the semiconductor industry and is directly overseeing all the developments that have been going on, and have actually, if they find that the project is feasible, it has. And you have examples before you, such as the Micron, and from other sectors. If you look at it, the Apple and the Foxconn thing that went up, right? So the processing of these projects was very swift, and because of the government's direct involvement in those projects and keen interest in those projects, they managed to circumvent all the bureaucratic hurdles that usually plague foreign investments in India, right? So this is a big plus, and this is another factor that adds on to the advantages that India has. That the government itself is very keen, and businesses looking to reshore or friendshore their supply chains in India would not face that kind of bureaucratic problem. Lastly, the fact that the question that you raised on domestic advantages, we would do well to remember that India has huge talent component in this sector. A lot of designing happens in India, and even for the advanced semiconductors, designing a lot of fabulous companies have the designing labs in India. And these companies, even though India does not have downstream advantages like the contenders like Vietnam or Malaysia, India has upstream advantages and relative upstream advantages. And this is something that companies looking to reshore to India could leverage.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Amit. Satya, let me come to you with the final question before we end this episode. Now that we've established that there can be significant advantages for the US in choosing India as its partner in friendshoring when it comes to production of legacy nodes, with the aim that the endeavor is targeted at countering Chinese dominance, can you very quickly talk a little bit about the way forward? What are the mechanisms, processes, and policy initiatives that the India and US could approach and work together with to kind of make this vision a reality?
Well, right now, most of the remedies are, they're nebulous, right? That they're not necessarily things that, uh, may work out in practice, but these are the potential avenues that can create this collaboration, right? So, first of all, on the demand side of things, and let me be clear that there are already bilateral platforms like the ISET that we mentioned, right? The Initiative on Critical and Emerging Tech, and US and India also signed an MOU on a semiconductor supply chain resilience and I think innovation partnership. Now, on the demand side of things, what the US can do is, for instance, like gradually, because the US can't necessarily just stop imports of Chinese chips and then say, hey, India will buy from you. Or they can do over a period of like 2 to 3 or 5 years, whatever. What they can do is, aside from helping, like, on the tech transfer side of things, helping Indian fabs become better, then also create an assured market for Indian made legacy chips, right? So maybe an incentive program for US chip companies or OEMs, the manufacturers that finally make the products where these chips go into. If they create an incentive program for them to source the required chips from India-based production facilities, that would be a good first step. This can be done by a mix of executive orders or legislation. So you can provide the usual tax credits or other financial benefits, which can be tied to the proportion of Indian-made chips that you use in your product, right? So, and you need to remember that in the semiconductor value chain, the reason why foundries become more profitable over time and iterate and innovate more is because of high consumer demand. So if Indian made foundries have an assured market from the get go, this will ensure that they can accelerate to the point of iteration and innovation quickly because of both the domestic market and US market. So aside from this, the US government can, let's say, you know, help Indian foundries attend some sort of certification process where there can be trustworthy foundries for the US government to source chips from, right? So, and because another concern that the US and the West has is that maybe Chinese made legacy chips have backdoors in them because you can't audit the supply chain for them, right? So, if Indian made chips can be afforded this kind of certification mechanism, or maybe if the US tells founders that, hey, these are the set of standards or protocols that we would like you to follow to be able to, to be a trusted foundry, that will also help both nations equally. Finally, I don't know, the usual things, right? The US also has a chip for alliance with Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Maybe, advocating for India's inclusion there would also help, these production facilities in those countries also maybe create established facilities in India, maybe have offshore facilities for diversification and resiliency, and also promote tech transfer. So there's a mix of demand and supply side incentives that can be done. The exact avenues will have to be figured out that way.
All right. That's really interesting stuff from both of you, Satya and Amit. I really believe that the way you've put forth the case that friendshoring should be the way forward for the US when it comes to securing competition, if not dominance, in the production of legacy or trailing edge nodes, and how India can come up as a viable alternative. I mean, this is a debate that doesn't just apply to the production of semiconductor chips, but also to the overall deliberation surrounding whether India can be a viable alternative to China in some countries, China plus one strategies. And there, the list of contenders is even longer, right? It's not just Southeast Asian countries, it's other East Asian and Latin American countries as well. And so, in this regard, I think it would be mutually beneficial for both India and the US to not just align on standards for production and create an incentive structure, but it also helps because both of them are witnessing an increasing convergence of interests vis a vis their mutual contempt of China. And so, in this regard, this has been a very fascinating discussion. Thank you, Satya and Amit. And with this, we come to the end of the episode. So, thank you also to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy. If I can quickly end by convincing you to participate in the Takshashila Institution's latest survey, the China Challenge Survey. You'll find the link on our website. This is the first iteration of an intended periodic survey to assess public sentiment on India-China relations. And we'd really be grateful to hear from you on what you think the nature, direction, and challenges of the India-China relationship is. Your feedback and comments on that survey will be really valuable to us. And so please head to takshashila.org.in and take the China Challenge Survey. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.